Thank you, Janelle and Sherwood Regional Library for hosting us today on Zoom. And thank you for everyone who's joining us. On behalf of Mount Vernon and Alexandria branches of AAUW, we're happy to see you. For those of you who are not members of AAUW, I'm Patsy Quick, the president of Mount Vernon branch AAUW. AAUW is a nationwide nonpartisan organization celebrating 140 years dedicated to advancing gender equity for women and girls through research, education, and advocacy. And I believe, Mary, are you there? No, okay. Oh, there she is, Mary.
Yes, hello, everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. My video is blocked, but I assure you I'm here. As Patsy said, this important organization has been promoting equity for women and girls since 1881. And in fact, our very own Mount Vernon branch is one of 11 branches just in Northern Virginia. We're open to all graduates who hold an associate's or higher degree from an accredited college or university. Let me give you a quick example of our advocacy. We recently mailed congratulatory letters to all the new state Virginia delegates, along with a copy of our public policy agenda focused on equality and individual rights, social justice, economic security, and education. And many of our members have already reached out to or held meetings with our elected representatives to discuss pending legislation. And so in addition to those types of efforts, programs such as the one we're having today, we also have a book group, game night, and I was at game night last night, by the way, loads of fun, dining out, and lots of other activities. Our monthly newsletter will give you the details. If you're interested in making a difference and meeting like-minded people, consider joining us and becoming an AAUW member, and our contact information will be provided later. And thank you for attending.
Thank you, Mary. To get us started, I want to introduce Diane Schreer. She's the co-president of Alexandria AAUW, and Solveig Eggers, the program VP for Mount Vernon AAUW. They'll describe the topic and introduce our panelists. So Solveig, will you begin? You're muted. You're muted.
Hey. So just a little definition of the school to prison pipeline to put the talk in context. The simple definition is that our current system of discipline in the schools seems to be leading to excessive involvement of youth in the criminal justice system. And this grew out of a very valid, this situation grew out of a very valid concern for safety that peaked in the 1990s with the rise of student crimes such as drug abuse and violence. And in 1999, the horrific mass shooting at Columbine School in Colorado. Laws were passed such as zero tolerance laws in 1994 and very vaguely interpreted laws that are loosely called disturbing school laws. Law enforcement officers called school resource officers, or SROs, were hired, and they now work in 45% of the 13,800 schools across the country. So you can imagine the diversity in which this is handled across the schools. Keep in mind also that there are almost 18,000 police departments who basically send out those SROs or provide them. The SROs enforce these laws that are given to them the zero tolerance and the disturbing school laws, and they use their full arrest powers to do so. The consequence seems to have been a criminalization of student misbehavior and an early and sometimes permanent exposure to the criminal justice system. The racial impact has been very disproportionate. 3 times as many Black students are arrested as white students for a similar offense. This impacts also disproportionately the students with disabilities. Sometimes the frequency of arrests and the sometimes vague interpretation often leads to ridiculous consequences, which may, however, have fateful consequences for a young person, such as the 13-year-old boy in New Mexico who was arrested for frequent fake burping in the school. I don't know what happened to him, but I have a lot of sympathy for him. And those 3 6-year-old girls who were arrested for talking in school. So things like that happened. But what struck me most about the current system is the transformation to an exclusionary rather than an internal approach to student discipline. So what this means is that students are easily expelled, suspended, arrested, sent to juvenile detention centers, instead of being marched down to the principal's office, to put it in a simple way, instead of handling it internally. I am not sure what the answer to this is, but I'm hoping that our speakers will lead us to some new ideas on this. And just finally, I want to say that it's clear that all communities want to be safe, want to have safe schools. A University of Chicago 2011 report on this caught my eye, and it said that safety in the schools is promoted not by the number of arrests that are made, but by the relationships forged between police and students, between police and teachers. In other words, they concluded that these officers may have a role to play, but maybe a somewhat different, modified role. Anyway, I'm now going to, I now just want to say thank you to our speakers for attending today. We will now start introducing them. Unfortunately, Valerie Slater, who is the Executive Director for RISE for Youth, will not join us until later. So hopefully we will still get a chance to see her. But Dr. Kevin Gilbert is here, and he has been in education for 25 years and currently serves as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for the Howard County Public School System in Howard County, Maryland. As the DEI Director, Dr. Gilbert is tasked with coordinating the school system's efforts to be more diverse, promote equity, and ensure inclusion throughout the district. Dr. Gilbert's leadership positions include serving as Vice President for Governance for the National Council of State Education Associations, Chair of the NEA Committee on Human and Civil Rights, and co-chair of the NEA Task Force on Discipline and the School to Prison Pipeline. Now, I have heard Dr. Gilbert speak about how restorative justice might be implemented in the schools, and I'm really looking forward to hearing more from him about that. And so now I'll turn this over to Diane, who will introduce our other speaker.
Yeah, thank you. I have some additional things to add to the bio, so I'm going to be reading this instead. So excuse me for 1 second. Parisa Degani Tafti is the Commonwealth Attorney for Arlington County and the cities of Falls Church. She was first elected to a 4-year term in November 2019, and she came to the office of Commonwealth Attorney with a 20-year record of criminal justice reform as an innocence protection attorney, a public defender, and a law professor. She sought the office because I always knew what I hoped for in a justice system, So I finally decided to live inside that hope. As a Commonwealth attorney, her core philosophy is that safety and justice are not opposite, but complementary values, and a prosecutor's primary responsibility is to treat crime as crime and people as people. Police has long recognized the impact of the criminal legal system on people of color and is committed to highlighting, addressing, and reversing these disparities. She has turned these values into policies of safety and justice for all, including providing fair discovery, eliminating preemptory strikes and juries, not requesting cash bail, not certifying children as adults, which is a huge problem, staffing the only conviction review unit in Virginia, establishing a new mental health docket, expanding drug court, reducing the jail populations to its lowest in history, securing indictments and convictions in all serious crimes, creating a novel restorative justice program for young people, and helping to win more than $700,000 in criminal justice grants to Arlington and the city of Falls Church. Prior to this work, she was served as an innocent protection attorney, representing innocent individuals in DC, Virginia, and Maryland. As a public defender litigating cases of constitutional magnitude, and as a law professor training the next generation criminal law attorneys. And she earned her law degree from NYU School of Law and graduate her BA in the University of California, Berkeley. And she loves Jane Austen and James Baldwin and Star Trek.
Okay, Diane, thank you. So how about you start with the first question then?
Okay, I'll be happy to. Okay, what concerns you most about the pipeline and what you are doing in this area? For either one of our panelists.
Designate one.
Oh, okay. Dr. Gilbert, what concerns you most about this?
I knew you were gonna come to me first. I was gonna say ladies first, but I'll be happy.
I knew both of you would have
I'll be happy to answer this one. So, good morning, everyone. Thank you for those warm introductions. And so, when I hear this question around what troubles me most, there's three things that come to the surface. A couple of them were already presented to us in some of the data. First is the dehumanization and the criminalization of our young people. That's the first thing that really stands out. As we see the school to prison pipeline and the results of it, it does lead to dehumanization and criminalization. And hopefully we'll get to talk a little bit more and delve deep into that. The second troubling aspect of the school to prison pipeline is the extreme disproportionality and disparity that exists within the system. So when we look at the numbers, there is a definite disproportionality in the number of Black students who are funneled into the school to prison pipeline. And we're seeing at a very alarming rate the increase of Black girls specifically as they're funneled into this based on the type of discipline practices and things that happen. And the third area is the role that bias and racism plays in this work. And what I mean by that is in law enforcement and education, those two institutions, the people within there have the most extreme amount of discretion on how they respond to incidents as they occur, whether they're violations of the law or whether they're violations of school code of conduct. And what I mean by discretion, the more ambiguous the law is or the more ambiguous the school policy is, that means the person who has to divvy out the consequence based on that can use a certain amount of discernment in deciding how they do that. So the more ambiguous a statement is, the more discretion you have opens the door for a lot more bias to creep in and or racism, whether it's intentional or unintentional, to be part of the equation. And so those three factors are the most troubling aspect. And in my work as the director of diversity, equity, inclusion, and I have to say, I will only be at Howard County until 2 weeks from now, as I just accepted an assistant superintendent position in New Jersey as their assistant superintendent for access and equity. So I'll be moving to another school district, but the work is still the same. And part of my role in my work will be looking at how we can reduce the ambiguous language in our policies, how we can lift up some professional development and learning opportunities for our educators to help mitigate some of the biases and racism that may surface in some of the discretion that is used, as well as advocate on behalf of how we can be a true educational system that doesn't focus so solely on how we punish and punitively deal with our young people, but how we can more work proactively to build proactive school cultures and climates that can help stop this work. And one of the ways we do that is building a restorative justice culture, not as an alternative to discipline or a punitive discipline, which is one of the factors people use it for, but as a culture and climate driving force that creates these school cultures and climates that allow us to focus more on the humanity of our young people and not so more on the consequences that come about on how we respond to these. And so, yeah, so I'll stop right there.
It's hard to come up with three things only that are disturbing, and I certainly agree with Dr. Gilbert and what he pointed out. I would say, so as not to repeat, I think the three things that trouble me are the lack of understanding really of what a school to prison pipeline is. People think of it as a, conveyor belt, where, a student does something and, is immediately arrested and detained for that. And while that sometimes happens in the extreme examples that we heard at the beginning, the thing that it is a lot more subtle than that. And I think what Dr. Gilbert was talking about with like the ambiguous policies, it really starts with, how you're getting in trouble in school. And what the children are starting to, how they're starting to view themselves, and then it goes to suspensions. And one of the things that I've been trying to address within our community is, how can we reduce suspensions, because they don't seem to be particularly effective, and they also seem to put people on a worse outcome in the long term than they otherwise would be. And the idea is that the more contacts you have that are punitive, the more likely you are to not finish school, the more likely you are to have more contacts with law enforcement, and the more likely you are then to end up incarcerated as an adult. So it's not a 10-year-old going to prison, although it has been. And occasionally can be. It's a much more sort of subtle series of seemingly innocuous and seemingly proportional responses at the time that then, have a disproportionate effect in the long run. And if you think about, the disproportionate effect on racial groups, and as Dr. Gilbert pointed out, very much for Black girls, it starts out with, who gets suspended more, or really who gets sent to the principal more often, and which goes back to how are people's actions perceived, and what are the background biases that we're coming into, with a 400-year of history that tells us, this false myth and this false story about Black criminality. So you have sort of like how small actions and how small disciplinary issues are perceived. How many times people are sent to the principal's office, how many times they end up in contact with, sort of larger administrative responses. And so it really isn't this very sort of like caricature or cartoonish idea of like putting kids on a conveyor belt and sending them to the local, juvenile detention facility. It's much more subtle than that. And so that's, and a lot of that idea lacks, happens because there's like a lack of coordination between stakeholders. And that's something that I think we all need to work on. And I see it a lot, because like folks in the school system, will sometimes, some folks are very attuned to it and other folks aren't. And the folks that aren't are looking at it with this sort of very cartoonish way. Whereas, if you're an honest prosecutor, you're looking at it in a much more subtle way. And for me, I'm trying to work with it, with the school system, and I'm trying to work with the police to really do preventative work so that we don't end up with kids facing charges in my office. The other issue that as Dr. Gilbert pointed out is the disproportionality that we see, and particularly with Black girls. And this has been coming for a really long time. I was at the Public Defender Service, and I want to say it was 2008, I think, or 2007, when I actually litigated a constitutional case in the Superior Court, the DC Superior Court, when a judge in the family court decided to send all of the girls to one judge because girls are different. But that happened to be the harshest judge on the bench, and there was no sort of attendant programming. There was no special diversion for girls. And, particularly in DC, the writing on the wall for us at the Public Defender Service at the time was that this is going to end up with more Black girls going into the juvenile detention center because girls are different, but there's no programming, there's no assessment tools, there's no way of differentiating girls. It just means that now we're going to be sort of shuttling all of the girls to the judge that's most likely to incarcerate them. This is an idea that sort of keeps rearing its head every few years, without any real efforts to address the issues that girls are facing, just trying to be harsher on girls because we haven't been, not really understanding or taking the time to differentiate why they should, or explain why they should be treated differently and how. Which sort of brings me back, so all of my points are kind of interconnected, and it brings me back to the very beginning, what we were saying at the very beginning, which is that we're at a moment right now of great danger and great opportunity. And the danger is that we are seeing a lot of kids getting into trouble. We're seeing a lot of kids misbehaving at school in ways that they weren't before COVID. We're seeing a lot of like pretty serious crimes being committed by kids, like carjackings, like for kids as young as 14 years old. And I'm not going to pretend like those things aren't happening, because they are, but I think the danger that we face is going back to those old tropes that we were using in the 90s about that dehumanize kids and that don't recognize that their brains are actually different and that they're not developed. And we had an excuse in the 90s, where we didn't know, right? We didn't know scientifically, but now we know scientifically that people's brains are not developed fully until their mid-20s. And so to go back to this idea of super predators and unremorseful kids and unredeemable kids is the idea that we would be going back to that is a real danger. And I see that sort of that rhetoric coming up again and again in the backlash to some of the reforms that we've seen over the last few years. But it's also a moment of great opportunity, because we know that what science tells us, and because we know that there is a wind of reform that says, like, let's use evidence-based policies, let's build stability and empathy. And that's the core of everything I try to do with the kids that become court involved, is build stability in their lives and help them build empathy for the people that they've harmed. And I think those are the sort of those are really driven by the tenets of restorative justice and restorative practices. And so I think it's a great opportunity to not just bring that into the legal system, but bring it into the community and bring it into schools as well, so that we can actually prevent some of the worst things that are happening from happening.
Thank you so much for your ideas on that. I really appreciate hearing that it is not a conveyor belt and that things are much more subtle. There's just so much that we on the outside don't know about what's going on in the schools. But perhaps because it's so subtle, it makes it harder to grapple with, because things occur incrementally and not so dramatically until we have a final result. So I want to ask, so in reading about, well, I should say all of you, but both of you, I discovered that there are certain concepts that are suggested for counteracting the current situation. But I think both of you mentioned them, but I'm going to ask you anyway, formally, to and maybe to make it more specific, because both of you mentioned the need to address the humanity of the kids, to address the kids where they are in their development, to see them not as just perpetrators, but to actually see them. And I'm just wondering how we can best take that into account. So I read several suggestions for improvements of the current situation, and both of you have mentioned them. Restorative justice, which seems to be an umbrella approach, which would change our attitude towards things. It would perhaps, it seems to be based on empathy and might perhaps allow us to see the humanity of children. But I also noted diversion as, and that may be more, but that may also be appropriate to kids. I know that Pariza has been working on that with adults and diverting them to pre-trial to other ways of dealing with crime. But there's also, what's also come up as an alternative and an important solution is the investment in resources, under-resourced communities. And unfortunately, our other speaker, Valerie Slater, suggested very strongly that we need to really pack the schools with others in addition to or perhaps instead of, I'm not sure, police officers, but people who do things like people who focus on the humanity of kids and behavioral problems, psychologists, social workers, nurses, these kinds of people who are often sorely lacking in the community. So I just want to ask you, and I'll start with Dr. Gilbert, what do you think would be, if you had the choice, what would be the most important? You mentioned several things, but what would be the most important antidote, starting antidote to the current situation that you described?
Yeah, and I think it's also important to know that there's no silver bullet to this, right? And I hate to use the word bullet; it's such an aggressive term to use. So there's no simple magic trick that we can use to solve this quagmire that we find ourselves in. A couple of things specifically, I'll start with the one that we are trying to utilize inside the Howard County Public School System that I know lots of school systems are using across, and that's restorative justice or restorative justice practices. Now, though I come out of the school of thought that really looks at using restorative justice as a overlay to school culture and climate. There are some institutions that want to push it as an alternative to suspension by focusing just on the practice piece. But however, we know that restorative justice is out of the indigenous philosophy that focuses on building healthy relationships. And the key to creating an effective restorative justice culture is encompassing that, find out what we need to do 100% of the time, all the time, to help build these relationships between our staff and our young people, between adults and young people, and really work with our adults in really shaping and framing how they approach their work. We stand on these couple of pillars like healthy building community, pedagogical practices, and creating spaces and opportunities where we talk about courageous subjects such as race, right? So yeah, so what does that have to do in this whole equation around dismantling the school to prison pipeline? If you go back to my earlier comment about how the discretion is involved in terms of how we respond to young people when they act out, it's first recognizing that acting out is an expression of need, right? And so how do we figure out what those young people need as opposed to how we can go about pushing them out? So in our restorative justice culture, we put an emphasis on looking at not only the qualitative data, the quantitative data, but also the qualitative data. We also look at the referral data on what is happening to move our young people from the classroom to the office. What are they doing? And then why is the end result being pushing them out of school? Now, if you overlay that with a philosophy of restorative justice that talks about dealing with the self-worth and the humanity of individuals, you're more apt to respond in a manner that protects the dignity of our young people, as opposed to trying to dehumanize them or criminalize them by action. So in instances where we have law enforcement in schools, right, we focus on the fact of not having law enforcement deal with routine disciplinary issues that can be handled in the school, because there's a legal statute and there's a school code of conduct statute. And when you infuse law enforcement with that, they have to come from their law enforcement background. And when law enforcement gets involved, we find ourselves having 14-year-old kids with felony charges that follow them throughout their life, right? So we have to come up with ways and mechanisms and ways that we thwart that. And we thwart that by saying, if you build a constant relationship with our young people, when something is happening with them and they trust you as a trusting adult, they're more apt to have conversations with you so you can actually get down into what is exactly that they need, instead of trying to move towards figuring out how to put them out of school, right? And so that last statement you said, part of this restorative justice culture is focused on how we build equitable learning environments, right? And how we also look at how we transform conflict. And sometimes that means an infusion of more counselors, an infusion of more psychiatrists, psychologists, an infusion of more social workers, so that we can help work to get to what is actually happening and the root cause that are leading to some of these behaviors that we are seeing, right? And so we also do a large investment in social emotional well-being. So social emotional learning is key for our instructors to understand how they work with their young people to, I don't like to say manage their emotions, because all emotions have a purpose, right? And we don't want to build robots, but absolutely try to understand from whence these emotions come, so that we can better help our young people deal with some of the conflicts and things that they have. But it's important, I want to note that we stress that we actually start working with our adults, because it's our adults who drive school culture and climate, right? And I often say this, when we talk about building relationships, when we talk about elevating social emotional well-being, our young people are not dumb. And our young people will say to us, Dr. Gilbert, I hear you every day talking about the importance of building social emotional well-being and having a fruitful relationship. But every morning I see you walk past Miss Such and Such and you don't even speak to her. So that invalidates my ability as an educator to help actually move the young people in the manner that we want to help build this positive school culture and climate. So I'll pause here and just say that through a restorative justice culture that focuses on shifting our school cultural climate, that looks at healthy relationships, that looks at building just and equitable learning environments, and transforming conflict in a manner that looks at the humanity and not the criminalization of our young people is a specific opportunity to kind of dismantle the school to prison pipeline.
I just want to follow up on that a little bit, because I remember you're saying, and I believe it was at the American Bar Association conference, that you talked about the need for community-wide training. And I was very interested in that, because I wondered, when you say community, did you mean the entire community, everybody that surrounds those kids, bringing in the parents, the school boards, explaining to the community what you're doing with your restorative justice in the schools, so they will understand that you're going in a different direction once you aim for restorative justice and perhaps a changed role for the officers. I was wondering about that community-based training, and if you still hold with that. And then my other question is, would you advocate for training these the school resource officers also to be part of this program, so that they can become mentors or mediators and aggression de-escalators and play some other role than the rather negative one that we're talking about?
Yeah, absolutely. And so a key component to looking at this from a culture and climate standpoint is community, right? And so what builds the healthy kind of nurtures those relationships is de-emphasis on the power dynamic that kind of exists in schools, where it becomes power over our young people, and more of a shared power dynamic in which inviting community, when we talk about community, all the members of a shared learning community, families, civic and social leaders, people who have a deep-rooted investment in what's happening, current stakeholders, our teachers, our ESPs, our social workers, counselors, all of those individuals really collectively working together. And so, yes, there's a component to what we're trying to do in our implementation that is very intentional and specific about engaging families and community in the work. One, understanding how important it is to build a restorative justice culture. Two, to also be part of those mechanisms that provide that support wing that our young people and our adults need to be as effective as possible in building these cultures. When it comes to law enforcement, what we do say is that, yes, we ask law enforcement to really home in on really understanding and getting trained in what the essence of restorative justice is and what that actually means, and how within the law enforcement community really wrestling with, when you come into a school building, the dynamics really kind of change, right? And you need to really hone in on understanding young people, understanding youth development and growth, understanding what responding to our young people looks like, and how we want that to be different inside of our schools, right? So we don't want the approach of coming from a deficit model when you're responding to our young people, but coming at a more proactive approach where we're actually spending time trying to learn who our young people are and how we can best meet their needs. And so what we found, ironically though, is that our law enforcement community, when we talk about doing our restorative justice trainings, prefer to actually do it amongst themselves, because they can actually spend time engaging in their world, in their language, and understanding how to break that language down and translate that into moving into our schools. Because a key component to building restorative justice culture is understanding the value of shared power. And to be completely honest with you, that's a hard dynamic to even thread through in education, where we have been built on this whole ideal of conformity. And it's definitely hard to drill through in law enforcement, where part of the law is actually this whole power dynamic of when we come in to respond to a criminal act, there are certain things we have to do. And so having those conversations around that to be effective with our implementation is crucial. So there is a definite connection with intentional bridging and bringing in our community members, but having really hard conversations about the amount of work it takes to build a truly effective restorative justice culture.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. When I was a teacher in Florida.
Yeah, okay. Okay. You're not going to the next question.
Oh, I'm not yet? All right.
Okay.
Okay, when I was a teacher in Florida, I saw, and this was Black girls get arrested for, if they happened on a fight going on in the hallway. This was in middle school. And they just happened on it at the end when the other girls who were cheering it on or fighting were being arrested. They would be arrested also. Now, this is a problem and there were other kids I found that were also had no hope for the future because the parents were drug dealers and they were blocked. Now, I know Alabama many years ago started a diversion program where they would put students into special homes where they would be in a house or something where they would get guidance instead of going to jail. What do you think we could be doing here? What type of diversion techniques do you think would be most effective at this point? What type of resources would work to have a system where we could successfully divert students away from crime? Parisa,
So we're reverting to Parisa now, right?
Yes.
Is it you're directing your question
To Parisa.
to Parisa?
Yes.
Parisa.
Well, I absolutely agree with Dr. Gilbert that there needs to be, this needs to become part of the fabric of, people's daily lives. And that it can't be a response only. My area of expertise is responses. So I'll talk about that a little bit. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean that responses are the only or the best way. This just happens to be sort of the area where I work. And I'm actually even trying to expand that, and I'll explain a little bit after. So what we've tried to do, we've created a restorative justice program that then the pilot program is for 16 to 26-year-olds, recognizing that that's sort of the sweet spot of where people can benefit the most who have done harm to restorative justice. And I think it probably makes sense to just take a second to step back and talk about the difference between the restorative justice and our current system. And I think of I like to call it restorative versus retributive, because the system that we have right now is very much retributive. So in a retributive system, the three questions that are asked are: what law was broken, who broke it, and how should they be punished? It is very focused on a sort of a punitive and carceral response. In the restorative system, that system asks, what was the harm? What does the person harmed need to heal, and who is responsible for that healing? So if you think about it, you're focused on, like, the focus is shifted from, like, who broke the law to who was harmed. Like, to who did it, to what does the harmed party need to heal, and from how do we punish the person, to how can the person who did it make it right, and support the healing. And what restorative justice gets characterized poorly and incorrectly as a way to just let people not face the consequences of their actions. But my argument is that it focuses on the people that are harmed, And it's important to do that because the current system that we have is really a poor method of getting them the answers and the feeling of safety and security that they need. And if you think about just one part of the system, which is that moment where somebody says, it takes the, pleads not guilty in court at their arraignment. Like our system is designed to tell the person who did the harm, don't admit, don't apologize, minimize, and try to beat the charge, right? And try to beat it. All of those things put walls between the humanity of the person who was harmed and the person who harmed. And like the people that are harmed want to know, like, why me? Why did this happen to me? Why did you pick me? Right? And is this going to happen to me again? And every piece of our system functions to separate those two people. And by the time somebody is finally apologizing at sentencing, all of that rings hollow. And it's still done with this, because there's still appeals that can happen and that sort of thing. It's still done with the spirit of trying to protect oneself rather than heal the person harmed. So, just that sort of first step does that. And the other piece, so my argument is that it's much more centered towards a victim or a harmed party to focus on restorative justice. And that's important for the person's healing, but it's also important because we know that 89% of the people that do harm are people who've been traumatized and harmed themselves. And so that's both a reason to help the healing. We've got a few cases in the office right now where there's just this like web of people who are victims, witnesses, and defendants in various different cases. And it's like the same person is a victim, a witness, and a defendant. It's like, you have to treat people, you have to give people an opportunity to experience healing in order for them to not harm again. But then the other part, so there's the healing of the harmed party, but then there's also the what I think of as much more active accountability. The accountability systems that we have right now are very passive. It's something that somebody does to you. That's what a punishment is. Something that somebody does to you. It's not what is really required to take the sort of like external motivating factor, and it provides some external motivating factors, although limited. And it takes work to turn those sort of external motivating factors into internal motivating factors. Like we want people to not do something not because they might get caught and get sentenced, but because it's a shame, right? And because they care about, the well-being of their community and, other internal motivations that we have. So, we want by, asking people to have an active role in accountability and to do sorry in the multitude of ways that restorative justice requires people to do sorry. And I'm happy to sort of talk about some examples, not that we've done in Arlington, but that appear in, some of the literature, because that way we're not sort of talking about real people who are going to be listening to this. They are real people, but they're real people whose stories have already been publicized. Like the doing of sorry and like acknowledging the impact of one's actions on others is really the hardest thing that we can do. And it's the thing that builds empathy the most. It's different for every single situation. Danielle Sered in the book Until We Reckon, which I highly recommend, talks about one situation of pretty extreme violence that was a hate crime, where I think it was 4 youth attacked a young girl on the subway, and it was an anti-Semitic hate crime. And they beat her up as part of the attack. One of the other girls that was involved was ripped out some hair, and so she ended up with like bloody patches on her head. And she opted to choose restorative justice in the common justice, I think that's what it's called, in Brooklyn. And a facilitator went back and forth between the one of the four who attacked her that was eligible for restorative justice. Two of them had pretty significant histories, and the prosecutor that decided that they were ineligible. One of them had no history whatsoever and was very sort of marginally involved, and so that person just got probation. And this individual who was actively involved but didn't have a significant prior record was eligible for and agreed to do restorative justice. And the facilitators went back and forth between each of the parties for months. And one of the things that the harmed party had wanted initially for the girl who attacked her to do was to shave her head. And as sort of part of her doing sorry. And the facilitator said, well, why do you want her to do that? And she said, well, because I had my hair ripped out, and like I had to look at myself in the mirror with like patches of my hair missing, and then I was so stressed out that my hair fell out, and so I basically was like bald. And so every day I've had to look at myself, and every day I cannot not be with this girl and what she did to me. And so they said, well, that's kind of a retributive response, like, what is it that you want out of this? And she says, I want her to think about me every single day. I want her to like have as much, I want to be on her mind as much as she has to be on mine. And so one of the many things that they asked the party who did the harm to do was to not take the subway at all for a year, because the victim in this the harmed party had been so traumatized because this happened on the subway that she was afraid to take the subway. And so the young girl that did the harm was not allowed to take the subway, and so which essentially meant that she had to walk or take a cab or to skip events. And she'd have to explain to her friends, well, or a bus, like, it's going to take me 2 hours to get to where you want to go because I have to take a bus now instead of taking the subway. And then the other thing that they required her to do just for this piece of it was to journal every single day about what she thought the harmed party was thinking and feeling. And it started out with, oh, I'm sure she felt really mad, like one line responses, to like 4, 5, 6 page journaling by the end of the year. And that, and by the way, the girl who did the harm went on to become a social worker, has never gotten in trouble since. It really gave her the opportunity to transform, whereas putting her into the retributive system would have literally just created more trauma for that. So it's again not a magic solution. It takes a lot of work. It doesn't succeed every time. But if you look at the data on the satisfaction of the people who are harmed with the process, it's in the 90s consistently. And I don't know of any industry that has, a 90+ satisfaction rate every time, right? Let alone an industry, and I say that in quotes, that is dealing with people who are traumatized. And then if you look at the recidivism rates, which I know that are not the only way and should not be the only way we gauge success, but they're a very easy way of gauging success. They drop from, I mean, I think the program in Fairfax, which, deals with very low level crimes for youth. And I'm only like 1 or 2 percentage points off when I say this. With no diversion, the recidivism rate after a year for the youth was 64%. With some sort of traditional diversion programs like shoplifting classes and that sort of thing, it was, I want to say 32%. And with restorative justice, it dropped down to 13%. And so it's extremely effective because it requires people to transform themselves into somebody who won't do this again. And it gives them the services and the tools that they need to do that. And then, sort of limiting the re-traumatization of the harmed party prevents them from ever becoming a harming party as well. So what we're trying to do right now, I mean, our pilot program focuses on 16 to 26-year-olds, pretty serious crimes, that would land them in detention or incarceration. And obviously, the harmed party there has to be a real live harmed party, and they have to be willing and an interested participant. And the idea is that if we go through this process, the people that did the harm, if everything goes well and is successful, then the charges will eventually be dismissed against them to try to preserve their record and their self-esteem. And we're doing it in a really careful way, where we're coordinating with the police, and we're coordinating with court services, which is the entity in Virginia that actually decides whether or not a juvenile is petitioned or diverted, and with our office, as well as Restorative Arlington, which is the organization that will be doing the conferencing. But that was a very long answer to sort of really give a sense of what do these things actually look like, and they look different for every case. But I think it's important to get actual concrete examples to really understand how that transformation happens on both sides.
Thank you. I just want to ask you one follow-up question on that. I didn't quite understand. Are you working with the schools on this, or are you dealing with youth that are already, have been arrested and are facing the system? Or is your office working in some cooperative way with the schools to have this implemented before it comes to crime?
So I have been working really actively with Restorative Arlington, and I'm a founding board member of the organization. And the idea of Restorative Arlington is to have sort of 3 prongs, one of which is schools, one of which is community, so that people have a place to go to resolve conflict in the community. And also somewhere for victims who don't want to report otherwise can go and get help. And then the legal system, which is, this part of the pilot program, and this one piece of what Restorative Arlington is doing that I'm the most deeply involved in is once people are court involved. Once they have committed a crime. Now we're trying to get to a place where it's pre-charge, but that's not where we are yet. Right now it's going to be sort of like, for youth, it might be pre-charge of court serve. It's certainly not going to be like pre-arrest, it's going to have to be sort of like once there's a decision to charge. They can get diverted from court services to restorative justice, or they can get diverted by us to restorative justice. The other piece, though, that I'm working on, I'm glad you reminded me of this, is Restorative Arlington is working on these other pieces, but I'm also actively trying to work in sort of trying to take all of us out of silos. So some of the issues that we're facing right now are fights, We're facing kids bringing BB guns to school. And, we're working together to start an immediate response that doesn't involve, like sort of like shaking sabers and saying that we're going to arrest everybody, but that is really sort of focused on education and sort of working on a longer term response. And one of the ideas we had was, looking for organizations to really come in and help do, experiential and interactive trainings about school code of conduct, about the juvenile justice system, about like consent and boundaries and sexual assault, and about gun safety. So really trying to, through games and through experiential learning, get some of these messages across in a way that the police department and the school system and our office and court services, like all of us sort of have a buy-in and are working on together to get solved. And again, that's the means by which restorative practices and restorative justice becomes a fabric of the schools is way beyond my ability to do. But as a start, right, trying to, when we see these problems, like bringing everybody into the room and talking about how we can promote education and respect, and then sort of planning for the longer term, planning on how do we promote those ideas and promote knowledge and empower kids in the longer term, but like we do it together in a coordinated manner. I think those are reflective of what we want restorative practices to be.
Right. Thank you so much for explaining that. That's it's so much more complicated than I thought. And it definitely seems to involve the entire community. So Diane, did you want to ask a question now? Where are you with that?
Well, before I do we have any questions from the audience right now? Does anyone want?
Janelle? Oh, okay.
I
Go
really,
ahead, Patsy.
yeah, I think all of this is fascinating, and it is so much more complicated and requires teamwork, people to work together. So how do you, I was a teacher as well, and that was when we opened a new school in the early 2000s. Our whole goal was to build community so that everyone would be on the same page and understand the same ideas and ideals that we wanted to have shared. How is that going? And today, because there are so many angry people, is there pushback and people they don't like this, and what do you do about that? And how do you bring people on board? Because it takes a lot of people, a well-trained people, I would think, who can speak to young people. I know I'm not the one to speak to the middle school and high school age kids. It takes a really special kind of conversation. So how does that all come about? How do you get everybody on board? It seems so overwhelming. And either one of you can answer.
I mean, I can start with the much small, Restorative Arlington has been working for about 2 years with organizations like Impact Justice and Restorative DC and Restorative Response Baltimore, with the RAFA in Nashville. So we've been working, we've had 45, like the first year we had 45 community members working in 3 working groups, learning about restorative justice and learning about how it can be implemented in school communities and the legal system. We spent probably 1,500 hours coming up with a strategic plan. And then the second year we've spent designing the pilot program. There's some programming also that the executive director of Restorative Arlington is working on with the schools in the community. But from my perspective, on the legal system team, we've been working on we spent a year designing a program that is responsive to what goes on in Arlington and what Arlington needs. So yeah, you're right that it's extraordinarily complicated. It takes a lot of community buy-in, and it's very slow. And it's like, for somebody like me who, I have very little patience. If I have an idea, like I want to get it done, I want to do it, and why is it taking so long? But it's really clear that with something like this, it's very easy to do it wrong. It's very easy to say that you're doing it and not really do it. But what's really, really hard, and is doing this in a way that has, that is consistent with best practices, that has community buy-in, and that has people sort of all rowing in the same direction. I think Dr. Gilbert can speak much better to some of the other issues, but just the one program has taken 2 years. And because we knew that we had to sort of really grow it up from the grassroots.
Yeah, I would only add to that. That's great. I would only add that we do see more effective work with schools when they do have partnerships with groups like what I hear is happening in Arlington with Restorative Arlington. And the goal is the same, right? To help move our schools and to help deal with some of these punitive responses is to help tailor our responses in a more restorative way. And so when you connect yourselves with groups that are doing the work in an effective manner, that helps elevate the work in schools. And to Miss, if I mess your name up, please forgive me, Miss Tafty, is that how you pronounce it? Okay, Miss Tafty's group, having groups like that connected with the schools can help in a very intentional way. Unfortunately, in some areas, though, they don't have a common thread like that, and so putting that together does take an massive amount of work, as well as communication. I love how Restorative Arlington put together a strategic plan that encompassed the work together. That's the kind of work it takes to actually mesh and bend this work together to bring out some positive results. And so, yeah, I'll sign on to everything Ms. Tafty said and just say that, we do see effective work when groups work collaboratively in that manner. My partner is the executive director of the Restorative Justice Partnership, which has done work with school districts across this country. Primarily, they just finished working with the Denver public school system, and they're actually doing some work in our school district where they work with the local union to kind of help connect some of these dots together with the schools, with the local union, with community organizations to kind of build kind of this infrastructure that Ms. Tafty talked about. And so when I talk about, understanding what restorative means in terms of sharing power, that's exactly where I'm getting at. When you got to bring these entities together to have these same kind of common conversations, to move to the same common goal and work in a collaborative manner, that's how you start seeing effective results in dismantling this.
Okay, it looks like, thank you. It looks like we have a question from Meg.
We actually, so I had raised my hand because we had a question before her question, but the person sent it to me directly. So no one else saw the question. It was from Mary, and Mary asks, what are the types of action we can take?
I'm assuming this based off this last conversation we had. I think really trying to connect the stakeholders together. So really trying to understand, and Ms. Tafty, you could probably be better at this because you've kind of done it from this stand, but from a school perspective, connecting with the school, seeing what they're kind of offering, kind of see what their work is, and if there's any way to patch up others within the community to get on the same page about where we want to go to kind of shift and change these numbers. If you're fortunate enough to have a school that is working on some restorative justice stuff, and you have a community organization that is kind of surrounding that school that kind of does this work, putting those two entities together would work, or bringing a group of people together, looking at the data to say we have a problem and coming up with solutions to that problem could also lead you into a manner of establishing some type of committed collaboration around building a restorative justice culture. Ms. Tafty, I don't know, you probably know more about this than I do.
Oh, I think everything you said is right. I think it depends on where you are, though. So if I can ask Mary sort of where she is, I can give a concrete answer potentially.
Mary?
My niece is a special ed supervisor for a portion of Fairfax County. I live in Alexandria, but she works in a bunch of the junior highs in more towards Annandale in that area.
Mhm.
And I thought it'd be interesting to at least pass along either some material or some phone numbers for her to use when she's working at the level and the age band that you've described. And she's in special needs, you know, working with the families and the staff. Somebody like that, if they had the connections, they could be part of the solution.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would start with asking the schools for data, as Dr. Gilbert pointed out. And then I would start talking to the school board and the board of supervisors about getting some restorative justice programming in the schools. It's going to take a long time, and it's going to take having a couple of directors of agencies and a couple of politicians behind her to fight this fight is really going to, and I hate to use the word fight, but to lift this work up and really bring it to Fairfax Public Schools will require the commitment of at least a couple of directors and politicians. So, I mean, I would look at court services. I would look at the Commonwealth Attorney's Office. I would look at the Board of Supervisors. I would look at the school superintendent. I would look at the diversity and equity and inclusion director. Those are people to start with.
Thank you. I just wanted to take something concrete and see if I could put some information at a level where it could be acted on.
And I put the Restorative Arlington strategic plan in the text, if you wanted to look at that.
Excellent, thank you.
In the chat, yeah.
Yes.
There's something in the chat, yeah. I noticed that. Okay, Janelle, we had another question here.
Yes.
Meg?
This one was from Meg. Restorative justice is important to be understood by all in the schools. Requires training for all. Are there sources of funding to help provide system-wide training? It's expensive and will take time.
I mean, there's all types of grants and other things that people can have access to. But it would have to take you kind of searching to see what you're looking for. I know in the school system, for example, in our school system, you know, we tried to secure grants with many philanthropic organizations who value restorative justice work and are trying to lift that work up. I know I just kind of mentioned to you Restorative Justice Partnership out of Denver. I know they have worked with schools to secure funding. For matter of fact, they're working with our local union from a grant that they secured from the National Education Association. So It would just take a look to see the search. One of the things for school systems that really want to do this work, it does take a little financial commitment based on budgets. So, right, so really pushing school systems like we've done in our school system to set aside the type of dollars that are necessary to build this out in an effective way. And you're exactly right. To do this work right from a school system's perspective, it takes an immense amount of investment in funds to do. And so, but whatever the school system can supply, if you're looking at building this out from the school system, there are grants and things that can be applied for.
Mhm. I think that going back to that American Bar Association conference, there was somebody there named Darren Aitchison, who is maybe from Chicago or some place like that, who is dedicated totally to restorative justice. So, I mean, a school system could theoretically hire somebody like that to look at the school system and perhaps have, suggestions for how to implement it. Do you know anything more about Mr. Atchison? But he was like 100%, and that was his one goal, was supporting restorative justice.
Yeah, I can get his email address. I met him at that first time at that particular conference, but I don't know any specifics about, how to. I have his email, so I can definitely provide that for you in a later email if you want to reach out to him and see if he'd like to give his information to you to send out to your membership or things like that.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Let's see, are there any more questions from the audience right now? Diane, back to you. Do you have something? Is she gone?
We've covered a tremendous amount, but I'm going to jump way back to the racial considerations, because that is an issue that hits you right in the face about this restorative justice and the racial considerations, because it's a major problem. Black children get arrested at a much higher rate. And what can we do to change? I'm not quite sure the correct word at this moment, but to modify, change, eliminate that discrimination. And that's eliminate, I know, is almost an impossible ideal to reach. But what can we do to stop it? Because they're being arrested at a much higher rate. Things that are children period are being arrested at a higher rate than adults. But Black children are far predominant in being arrested.
May I just,
what can we do to stop this or fight against this?
may I just interject here something about these laws, the school disturbance laws that are so loosely written? Part of what I read about this indicated that they leave open to these school resource officers to have any kind of bias that they come with. It's just so loose there that there's just, too many slips allowed in the enforcement of these laws. But, that's just my superficial understanding of it.
Yeah.
But how do you all feel about that? I mean, do you feel that this is a major part of this, the racial disproportionality that we see, or that is, statistically shown?
Either one of you.
I know that Dr. Gilbert mentioned that as a major concern. So,
I mean, so that is a huge question, and I'm not going to pretend like I have the answer of like how to stop racial disparities from happening. I mean, the first step is obviously to be aware and interested in stopping them. One of the things that we did in Virginia was we legislatively uh, took disorderly conduct, on the bus and at school, outside of the criminal code. So, if a child sort of does a thing that's an actual crime, it's one thing, but disorderly conduct, sort of covers bad things that are not any other crime. And I supported this, and I know that Valerie Slater at Rise was a major force behind it. So changing the law to take some of those ambiguities that Dr. Gilbert was talking about out, and sort of preventing people from being able to say, well, this is just sort of amorphously, ambiguously, disorderly. Another piece of it is being conscious when we do. And one of the things that I worry about with all of the diversion programs that we create is we went, again, I talk about, we went for 400 years having, this false narrative about Black dangerousness that was created in order to justify slavery. And then, we created the Black codes in order to keep people into as close a situation of slavery as we could. And those Black codes, by the way, included like 2 Black men standing on a corner being a crime, or being Black and free in Alabama, like that was a crime. We had those, and then we had a period where we almost got it right, after the turn of the 20th century, where we started to realize that, people commit crimes because of their socioeconomic circumstances. But what we didn't do is apply that to Black people. That principle got applied to European immigrants. And so, if you were, a white European immigrant, it became accepted that that any criminal behavior was coming out, was, sort of socially influenced. But what we did at that time was we turned from biological determinism of, Black people being somehow biologically different to cultural determinism, where, it was Black culture that was problematic. And so, we created a kinder, more gentler, but still racist system. And what we are at a point right now, and I do think this is an opportunity because of the way that, we're thinking about the criminal legal reform as like the next civil rights frontier, is we have an opportunity to, create reforms that take into consideration what the history has been, and to unwind some of that. And so there's a book called Colorizing, Restorative Justice, which really has been instructive to me about how to create programming that doesn't replicate some of the problems that we had 100 years ago when we were trying to make the system better, and when we embarked on a progressive era. And that includes, being very careful about, who is, which harmed parties are okay with restorative justice, and to make sure that it's not just, that it doesn't end up being, excluding cases where like there's a white victim and a Black person who did the harm. You don't want to be in a position where victims are making those sort of, judgments based on implicit bias or explicit bias, right? So like we're very much aware of that, and aware of where we try to focus the cases to have the most impact on sort of like reversing the system. But at the end of the day, like, this is a much bigger problem than the criminal legal system. This is a problem about housing and healthcare and educational opportunities and job opportunities. And until we get to a point where, you know, we're addressing, you know, the racial covenants and the redlining that happened, and until we're at a point where we're addressing the fact that, you know, our school systems, our public school systems have really just been, you know, are being disassembled, and in the first place shouldn't be dependent on the property values, you know, in the immediately surrounding neighborhoods. Until we get to some of those, you know, which is all about housing and, you know, where can people afford to live? So, you know, all of these issues that are, you know, significant civil rights issues are all interconnected to each other. And so the answer is going to have to be in every one of these arenas, from climate justice to housing, for us to really solve the problems.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you so much for that comprehensive view. I think we need to hear how complicated things are. So, and I want to thank both of you for being here and for contributing so greatly to our understanding of this topic. I don't want to take, I know you both have lots of other things to do. So Diane, do you want to say something at the end?
I just want to thank both of you. This has been very informative and very, very interesting. And I've learned a lot from it. And I'm sure most of our participants have also. So thank you very much for coming today and for talking to us.
So
I really appreciate your being here, both of you. Thank you so much. Your knowledge and expertise and your examples have greatly enabled us to, and informed us, enabled us to understand how complex and how important it is at the same time to make these changes. It requires a huge change of mindset, actually, for our society. So it's a big job, but I hope we all stick in there and get it done. We thank you. We appreciate all you're doing. Thank you so much. And thank you, Janelle at Sherwood, for hosting us today, and all of our attendees for coming and for the great questions we had. So thank you very much for everybody. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your afternoon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye,
Thank
everybody.
you.
thank you. Thank you.